A reading from the Gospel of Luke. Hear what God's Spirit is saying to you. And he said, a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. And not many days after the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance in riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. And when he came to himself, he said, How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. But the father said to his servants, Bring forth the best robe, and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand, and shoes on his feet, and bring hither the fatted calf, and kill it, and let us eat, and be merry. For this my son was dead, and is alive again. He was lost, and is found. And they began to be merry. Here ends the reading of the words that give us insight to God. May God grant to us wisdom and courage for interpretation.
Today is the final sermon in our Beyond Belief series, the Theology of the late, great Marcus Borg. On the first Sunday, I talked about pre-critical naivete, or blind acceptance. That is, just believing what you have been taught about faith because of who told you. For instance, that in Genesis 1, the world was literally created in 7 days. Perhaps believing that because a pastor or a guardian taught us that. Then last week, I talked about the stage of critical thinking, or what I might call deconstruction, which is recognizing that there are certain things that are factual about the world that might not gel completely with those things that we have been taught. So, for instance, we looked at the story of the Exodus and the parting of the sea, recognizing that seas don't typically part like that. How is it that you make sense of what you know to be factual about the world with what we also have been taught? And then today we're going to move on to what Borg calls post-critical naivete, and what I call reconstruction. You see, a lot of people, I think, get stuck in phase 1 or 2. It can feel like a choice that you have to make. That either you are going to deny all the science that you have been taught, or everything that you know to be factual about the world, and you're going to embrace a literal interpretation of the Bible. You're going to believe that despite all the evidence, the world really was created in 7 days. Or you're going to say, hey, I know that generally seas don't part, but in this particular case, God is all-powerful and God parted the sea. So you might land in that camp, or you might land in the camp where you say, look, I know what is factual in this universe. I know that the universe was formed over billions of years. The earth was formed over billions of years. And that means that most of what's in the Bible isn't relevant to me at all. It's all made up. But I think that what we're invited to do, what Borg invites us to do, is to embrace a different kind of faith. A faith that does not buy into that false dichotomy that it's either or, but that it can be both and, which is a place that is beyond belief. To get there, I want to look at the parable of the prodigal son. So far, intentionally, I've stayed in the Hebrew Bible because I think that perhaps we have less emotional attachment to some of those scriptures. We have more emotional attachment as we move into the New Testament. But today, I want to look at the prodigal son. You know the story, right? It's a very familiar Christian story, so familiar that people outside of the church know the story as well, that there is a wealthy father who has two sons. And the youngest son, and look, speaking as the oldest child, let me tell you, it's always the youngest son. The youngest son decides, I've got another oldest child somewhere. The youngest son decides that he is going to go off on his own. And so he asks his father for his inheritance early. And his father decides to give it to him. And so the youngest forges ahead on his own path, and he lives it up big time. Before long, he has spent absolutely everything, and he is taking whatever job that he can, including taking care of the pigs and living in the squalor with them. He's even eating their pods that the pigs have to eat, and he starts to think, you know what? Maybe life wasn't so bad at home. Maybe I had it pretty good, actually. And then he starts thinking about even his father's servants. He said, even they have enough food to eat. More than enough. So he thinks that maybe if he goes back home and he begs his father for forgiveness, he begs his father to take him back in, that just maybe his father will let him come home. And so he travels back to his house. He's prepared to grovel at his father's feet. But as soon as his father sees him, his father comes running with open arms and embraces him. And more than that, he says, go get him a robe and sandals and a ring and kill the fatted calf. We're going to have a celebration. And that younger son is in awe that his father welcomed him right back. And the older son hears about what has happened, and he's not so thrilled about his father's graciousness. He says, I was the one who stayed here. I didn't ask for my inheritance. I did everything the right way. And you're not celebrating me. You're celebrating my little brother. And the dad says, yeah, aren't we glad that he is here, that he is alive, and that we're back together again? And the story ends there. There's no explanation given. It is just that story and is left for our interpretation. And theologians have gotten a lot from this. Some theologians have said, well, of course, God is like the Father, and God always welcomes us back. God always throws a celebratory feast. Even when we stray, God welcomes us back. Some have said that, it invites us to think about how we're going to live our lives. We might put ourselves in the shoes of the prodigal son who goes out and lives it up and lives for himself and then ultimately finds that not only can he not survive, but that perhaps that's unfulfilling. Or we might put ourselves in the shoes of the older brother and say, where is it that we have greed or resentment? Or where is it that we are not being gracious enough? Are there places like that in our lives? Or we might read the story and see that there seems to be tacit acceptance that this family has servants. What does that say about liberation and God's desire for all people to be liberated? We might look at this story as a whole, and we might say, what is this story saying in our life today? How is it that this story that was told so many years ago is applicable to 21st century America? Where are the places that we have strayed, and how is God calling us to the right path? You see, there are lots of different interpretations of this parable, and we're not told what the right way is. But you know one thing that strikes me about this parable? In all the theological work that has been done, every time that we talk about the prodigal son, you know what question we never really ask? Did this actually happen? Did the prodigal son actually leave his family and then come back? We never ask that because it doesn't matter, right? It's completely irrelevant. It is a story that is designed to help us open our imagination. And so Jesus taught in parables, I think primarily for that reason. Parables sometimes confused and infuriated people, but they also often opened people's minds and people's hearts, people's imaginations. And so I would say that a reconstructed faith, a post-critical naivete type faith, is a faith that is less concerned with factuality and is more concerned with truth, right? It doesn't matter if there actually ever was a son who left his father and then came back in exactly the way that the story described, because it's a true story. That kind of thing happens all the time, you see? And so I think the invitation of faith in our biblical text is a similar type of invitation. The world wasn't created in 7 literal days, but it's true that God is a part of all of creation, right? There probably wasn't a Garden of Eden, but it's true that human beings are always tempted to have more. There probably wasn't a literal flood that covered the entire earth. We do know that there were several smaller floods that happened in fertile river valleys. But you know what is true? That God promises to be with us all along the way. It's probably not true that there was a mass exodus from Egypt, but it is true that God desires liberation. Probably isn't factual that there was a lion that Daniel faced, or that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had to go through literal fire. But you know what is true? That we have to face lions of our own, that we have to go through the flames ourselves, and that God is with us along the way. There probably wasn't literally a Goliath, but you know what? It is true that God roots for the underdog, you see? And so this is what a reconstructed faith looks like. A faith that recognizes the value in the story, the truth in the story, even when it isn't factual. I get a lot of pushback online sometimes about Jesus. I know that's hard to imagine, right? That you would get pushback about Jesus. Jesus wasn't a controversial figure at all or anything. But the pushback I often get is from folks who say, well, why is Jesus valuable? Or Jesus didn't even exist. And I take issue with that because we know that historically Jesus did exist. Like there's evidence of that. There's evidence from non-Christian sources, from both Jewish and Roman historians. We have evidence in sources that didn't depend upon each other. And the story of Jesus is one that is unlikely for people to have made up because Jesus didn't really do what he was supposed to do, right? It's a weird thing to claim that Jesus is a Messiah whenever he didn't do what the Messiah was supposed to do. That's a weird claim to make. because the Messiah was supposed to overthrow the Roman Empire and reestablish a kingdom. Jesus didn't do that. Instead, he talked about a nonviolent revolution. It is also hard because Christians have to do a lot of fancy footwork to make it look like Jesus was successful. Because if you're outside of Christianity, it looks like Jesus lost. It looks like the Romans won. And so it's an unlikely story to have been made up. Jesus was a real historical person. I think we can say that with certainty. I think we can say for certain that Jesus was born, that he lived under the oppression of the Roman Empire, that he was a brown-skinned Palestinian Jewish peasant who had to deal with that reality. I think we can safely say that Jesus was baptized and that he went out and that he proclaimed a message of hope and liberation, that he proclaimed the reign of God that was in contrast to the Roman Empire, that he proclaimed radical nonviolence and it got him killed. You know, there's that story where Jesus is hanging on the cross and there are two, it's translated into English as thieves, but it's really freedom fighters. And he's sitting there, he's hanging there next to those two freedom fighters, and they were violent freedom fighters. But Jesus, there in the middle, was a nonviolent freedom fighter, you see? And he was crucified by the Romans. And what happens next? The resurrection, I would say, is one of these points where the truth is more important than what actually happened. Because Christians don't agree. Christians have never agreed. Christians haven't ever agreed if there was a resurrection that was like spiritual, like it was just Jesus' spirit that raised into heaven, or if it was Jesus' actual body, or if it was metaphorical. I'll let you in on a little secret. The Gospels don't even agree on that. The Gospel of Mark originally ended with just an empty tomb. So I would say that Christians get real wrapped up in the proper belief about that. And more so, they get wrapped up in people believing exactly the way that they believe, right? Like you've got to believe the way that I believe or else you're not orthodox enough. You got to believe the way that I believe or else you're not a real Christian. And I would say focusing on the fact misses the point when the point is the truth. We know that resurrection is true because we see it. We see it all the time. We see it in hope. We see it in our lives. You see, whenever we are really genuinely following the teachings of Jesus Christ, whenever we are his hands and feet out in the world, it is resurrection. And so I think that a reconstructed faith looks like this. A reconstructed faith invites us to answer the questions of the Bible with our lives. Now that puts a lot of pressure on us, I know. Imperfect people who mess up all the time, I get it. But it's also a wonderful opportunity, isn't it? To think about our lives as a response to the text. How do we know that God is always with us? Well, we show it to one another through our lives. How do we know that God liberates? We work for that in our lives. How do we know that Jesus is at work in our world? We show it through our lives. You see? What is a reconstructed faith? A faith that is reconstructed is a faith that accepts the truth of the Bible, that accepts the truth of Jesus, that accepts the truth of God's presence in the world, recognizing that much of the way the story has been told has been the attempts of faithful people looking at how God is present in their lives and in the world, but is necessarily limited to the culture and the time in which they wrote it. Just like, I hate to say this, I know we like to think that we're all perfect and all, but just like if we were writing the story today, it would be limited by our own experience as well. That even if Caleb Lyons was writing down the gospel, to the best of my understanding, that it would be wrong because it's only a partial truth, you see? That God is a divine mystery that is beyond us. And all we can do is recognize the best we can, to tell the story the best we can, to look at the truth and articulate the truth the best we can out of our experience. But when we live that truth, the truth that connects to those ancient stories and merges with our modern story, that can be a powerful truth. A truth that can speak the truth in love to power. A truth that can give us hope even in the midst of despair. A truth that can call us to action even when it doesn't feel like there's a point. A truth that can help us to join hands and recognize that we are in this life together. So I embrace a reconstructed faith. A faith in which I can see God in all areas of my life. Where I'm not caught up in what did or didn't happen, but what is and isn't true. May we lead lives of truth and hope and joy and peace. May it be so, and thanks be to God. Amen.